Thank you, JB, very much for a very, very kind and generous introduction. And thank you for all that you've done to support me and UCAN in the last 7.5 years. And thank you, Tripp and Ben and Steve, for the invitation to be with you this morning. Thank you all for being here this morning early. I know that this is a great speaker series, and there have been some tremendous speakers on Friday forums, and clearly it's summertime and all the really good ones were on vacation this month, so they settled for me. But it is an honor to be with you this morning and talk a little bit about what we're doing with early stage capital in South Carolina. And as JB mentioned, I am a recovering consultant, so I hope you'll indulge me a little bit with slides. That's the only way I know how to communicate at this stage in my career. But I'll try not to bore you with too many numbers. What I'd like to do instead is to tell you 4 short stories. And JB basically told you the first one, so we can skip through that one pretty quickly. But I was going to tell you a Genesis to numbers story, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. A story about a near-death experience, a story about a big win, and then wrap it up with a story about a flywheel effect. So the Genesis story I want to tell you was sort of my side of the UCAN founding story, and JB covered a lot of this, so I'll move through it pretty quickly. But as he mentioned, I was in Atlanta, had an office in one of those buildings, but spent most of my time on one of those planes. And my wife and I were newlyweds, and she moved from Oklahoma and didn't know anybody in Atlanta, and I was gone all the time, and we decided pretty quickly, this isn't really the life we want to live. So we started thinking about what we might want to do, and being from South Carolina, I had always wanted to come back to South Carolina, and being Clemson grad, I had a lot of good friends who were here, and so I visited Greenville relatively frequently. And on one of those trips, my wife and I stood on that bridge that you all recognize, right about where those people are standing in the middle, and said, I think this might be the right place for us. What can I do to keep myself busy? And so, as JB mentioned, I started networking and showed up at that luncheon event. And the rest of the story he didn't tell you is we had that initial conversation, and he called me and said, hey, it was great to meet you. I think we're really looking for somebody that's got venture capital experience. So good luck. We'll see you around. And as he mentioned, some time went by and they were ready to get started, and called me back and a couple months later and basically said, hey, if you're still interested, we might take a chance on you. So come up and talk to us. So in fact they did. And so in April of 2008, we got started thanks to the efforts of as JB mentioned, himself and Tim Reed and lots of folks in the community and the chamber. So it was an exciting time to get started. Of course, we didn't know we were about to fall off a cliff economically. So in hindsight, we might have done things differently if we'd known that, but it turned out to actually be a great time to start an angel investment group. And as JB mentioned, I did have a high growth startup of my own, although we've capped our growth at this point. So there'll be no further growth there. But it's been fun to start our family in here and have all 3 of our kids be native Greenvillians. We love this place. So what we're doing is angel investing. So people ask me, okay, well, tell me what that means. And I hesitate to use this example, but it's a touch point that some people can relate to. So how many of you have seen Shark Tank, right? Okay, so most people are familiar with that concept. And so I'll start there, all right? So you've got these folks who've made it big. They're wealthy. They sit in a room and invite entrepreneurs to come in and pitch their idea, and they grill them with a lot of questions. And at the end of the day, decide if they're going to give them some capital, right? So this is obviously designed for Hollywood. They dramatize the whole thing. It's meant for TV. But at the end of the day, they're trying to put capital and expertise to work supporting these would-be high-growth companies and entrepreneurs. So that's not exactly what we do, but there are some parallels. So we're not sharks. We're really trying to be angels. And we don't care so much about Hollywood and drama. What we care about is our hometowns and investing in and around our hometowns. We care about discipline and diligence in our process for making investments. But at the end of the day, we're doing the same thing. We're trying to provide capital and expertise to high growth startups. We also get lots of questions about, okay, well, how does that fit into other types of capital that we might seek out as an early stage company? So a lot of times I'll start with a framework that looks like this, and we use a cash curve. So typically when you're a high growth entrepreneur, you're going to have to spend money before you can make money. You've got to invest in the prototyping and the patents and putting all the systems in place you need to start this company. And so in the early seed stages, you might need several $1,000s to get that part of the company going. Hopefully you get to a point where you can go to market and start to sell something and start using customers' money instead of somebody else's money. And we'll think about that as a startup stage where you might need a few $100,000 to a couple $1 million as an entrepreneur. Hopefully you get some traction and you grow quickly and you get to a growth mode where you might need a couple of million or a few $1,000,000. And then if you're successful and you make it to a later stage company, then you might want to grow internationally or acquire other companies, and so you might need tens of millions of dollars. And so along that cash curve, you've got different opportunities and different potential sources of capital. The best one of those in the early stage of a company's life is bootstrapping, using your own resources, your own pluck to go out there and figure out how to use your savings and your credit cards and your ability to barter with vendors to buy you some time on cash flow so that you can help yourself get out of the so-called valley of death when you're burning cash before you're making cash. So bootstrapping is a great way to start, but if you need a lot of capital, a lot of folks don't necessarily have a lot of capital to start a business with. So the next best place to go for capital is friends and family. Or in this business, people will call it FF&F, friends, family, and fools. People that will give you money just because they love you, whether it's a good idea or not. And it turns out that's actually a very, very significant part of the capital that goes to work in early stage businesses in this country. So you get that capital and you get going, and hopefully you get into a growth mode, like I said, and once you're growing, hopefully you get access to some more resources. So a bank might talk to you once you're past the point of making money, right? So unless you've got a lot of assets to start with, or you're generating a lot of cash, you're not a bankable company. The bank is not designed to take that kind of risk, particularly in this regulatory environment. So a bank's not a great option at the early stages. We traditionally think about venture capital for early stage companies, but for lots of reasons I don't have time to go into this morning, venture capitalists don't really invest at the very early stages of a company's life these days anymore. And then of course, if you're really successful and you grow, you've got sources like private equity, but they don't help you very much back in this startup stage where there's a gap in the marketplace. So that's where angels come in. Angels are individuals who have their own capital that they're willing to invest in very risky early stage companies when nobody else will play that game. So angels fill a really important gap in the capital marketplace for entrepreneurs. And so that's what we try to do with UCAN, is to bring together folks in the community who are interested in this asset class, interested in putting capital to work, and interested in investing their expertise, their know-how, their connections to help these entrepreneurs try to make it through that valley of death and survive and be successful. So that's what Tim and JB and others in town had the notion to do when we started back in 07 and 08. And so that's what we've been doing for the last 7 years. Let me talk briefly about the kinds of things that we're looking for. Not every business fits our model. We are focused on the Southeast region, not exclusively in South Carolina. There's lots of reasons why it makes sense for us to invest in our region and build relationships with other investors in other states. We aren't investing at the very earliest stages of a company's life. When it's a concept, that's a little bit too early for us. We really want to invest at the go-to-market stage, where we're within sight of being able to generate revenue again, so we can start to use customer money instead of investor capital, because we don't necessarily have a lot of depth of early stage capital in our market. We want to get to cash flows from revenues as quickly as we can. And then of course, when you get into later stages, you need more capital. We don't have the depth of capital needed to fund a company like a VC or a private equity shop would. So we're focused on the startup stage. As JB mentioned, it's all about the jockey more than the horse. So we spend a lot of time trying to understand entrepreneurs. Can we trust them? Are they credible? Are they resourceful? Are they dedicated? Have they got skin in the game? All those things that are hard to put a metric on, but you pick up over time how to evaluate the wherewithal of an entrepreneur. From an industry standpoint, we get that question a lot. We're really agnostic about industries. What we're looking for is a few different characteristics, more so than the industry itself. Is there some compelling competitive advantage? Maybe it's intellectual property, maybe it's a business model, but it's got to be defensible in some way. But more importantly, in most cases, it's got to be scalable and capital efficient. So again, we don't have tens of millions of dollars to put behind these companies. We don't have a lot of venture capital here in South Carolina to help us do that with. So we want to find business models that can get to pretty high growth pretty quickly without a ton of capital. So maybe a couple of rounds of angel money of a couple $1 million to get to a runway that's really high growth and can prove to a strategic buyer that this business might be one worth buying, which is how our investors make money. We're trying to buy low. These are privately held companies, not publicly traded. So we're trying to buy low and ultimately sell high to a strategic buyer. And so the structure of our investments are typically equity placements in these companies. So we're buying a piece of ownership in the company, hoping that ultimately we can generate a 50% rate of return on our investments. And the reason for that is because, as you know, most startups don't make it. This is a very, very risky asset class, and half the things we invest in we expect will go bust. So we're swinging for the fences, and we know we're going to strike out quite a bit. So we need to swing at pitches such that if we connect on that pitch, we can hit it out of the park. That's how you have to think about a venture portfolio. Is you got to take your losses and be willing to know you're going to strike out a bunch, but kind of be the Babe Ruth, right? You strike out a bunch, but hopefully you hit some home runs. And at the end of the day, and we've got data to prove this, angels can generate very attractive rates of return with that kind of portfolio, 20+% rates of return over time in an asset class like this. So we're careful about how we structure our investments to help us get to that kind of return potential. So that's what we do. I do want to share a few numbers with you. JB mentioned some of these, but just to put it in a little bit more granular terms, we've reviewed over 1,400 business plans at this point. We've invited almost a couple of hundred companies to come and present to our members. We've invested over $12 million in 39 companies in 73 rounds of investment, so that means we've invested multiple times in many companies. Across that portfolio, those companies have raised, alongside of us, $200 million plus. We've syndicated with lots of angels and VCs around the region and around the country. We have invested 80% of our dollars in South Carolina. So I mentioned we don't invest exclusively in South Carolina, but we certainly have a bias for South Carolina. So it's encouraging to us that we found enough attractive investments inside the state of South Carolina to put our money to work here. The 23 South Carolina companies in our portfolio have generated over 350 jobs. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And as JB mentioned, we're starting to generate attractive returns. So the rounds of investment that we've exited so far have generated 2.5 times our money, which puts us in line with where we want to be. Actually, our IRR on that is quite a bit better than 20% because we've been able to exit really quickly. So we're excited about our portfolio. We have had losses. We've had 6 companies in the portfolio that have failed. That's inevitable, but we're ahead of the J curve you'd expect at this point in terms of failure rate to win rate. So we're excited about our portfolio. And as JB mentioned, because of the investments we've made, the network we've invested with, and the exits we've had, it was fun to see us ranked in the top 10 last year. And I put this up here not really to brag, but to say this is another example of it being really cool to see Greenville, South Carolina on a list with groups that are in California and Boston and the places you'd expect to see, top 10 angel groups and venture capital. So it's fun to see little old Greenville on a list with those folks. So I've got tons of stories from our portfolio that I don't have time to share with you this morning, but I'll just give you a sample of some of the things that you may have heard of that are South Carolina companies we've invested in. Folks like Kiatech here at GHS that are working on things that can really make an impact from a cancer diagnostic standpoint. You've probably read about Sela Genomics and their personalized medicine business. Charleston Pharma is working on immunotherapies for cancer. Sable Medical in Charleston was our first exit, which generated a 2,800% rate of return for us. But I have to say that was because we did it in about 4 months, right? So the time value money made that really high, more so than the magnitude. But 3 times your money in 4 months is pretty good. So if you have a deal like that, please send it to us. On the software side, we see lots of cool technology from visual. Pandoodle in Columbia is a company that has some really cool optical recognition technology where they can do some really cool post-production things with video for brand placement and things like that. ActiveEd is a local company doing some really cool things in education. They've built a platform for active learning for kids in schools, which is great because it not only helps them learn better, but it helps mitigate behavior problems and gives them a way to be active and mitigate health problems in schools as well. You've probably read about IronYard teaching the world to code. You may have read about Zip It doing some really cool things in the Internet of Things. We've got companies that are changing the world from a transportation standpoint, from an industrial standpoint in terms of measurement and techniques. Again, I don't have time to go into the details. But then the last category is maybe everybody's favorite, steak. Right? So we do have one investment in the New York Butcher Shop. We don't typically do consumer and retail, but this is a great franchise concept that we really like. And so let me go ahead and plant the seed. If you're thinking about what you're going to cook for dinner this weekend, stop by your local butcher shop on Augusta or Woodruff, and the folks at New York Butcher Shop will take good care of you. So I wanted to just give you a flavor of sort of what we do as an angel group with this first story, and wrap it up by saying, sort of the genesis of numbers thing. I shared a few numbers, but if you think about the biblical version of that, we're kind of not quite to the promised land. We see it out there. We see some milk and honey in our portfolio, and we're headed in the right direction, but we're not quite there yet. But excited about where we've come and where we started, and appreciate all the support in the community that's gotten us where we are today. So let me shift gears and tell you about a near-death experience. And fortunately, in light of events of this week, this is not a literal near-death experience, but it is a story about Proterra. The fire this week was obviously not a great thing, but I think the impact of that over the long term is going to be relatively minimal. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, so I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a period earlier in the company's life that illustrates the power of an angel investor network. So back in 2010, with the effort of a lot of folks probably in this room and the community and the city, Proterra, a company that was founded in Colorado, selected Greenville as the place where it was going to move its manufacturing, ultimately decided to move its headquarters here. These guys are building the next generation public transit bus run on batteries, which obviously does great things for long-term costs for cities that have to pay for these buses, great things for the environment because you're taking all those diesel fumes out of the environment, less noise pollution, lots of great things that come from this Proterra technology. So they came, announced this move in 2010. Later in 2010, they got the funding they needed to start building the manufacturing facility here. So that was great news. A company called MK Energy, a hedge fund, decided to invest and put $20 million in the company. So everything's going along fine. We're all excited. And $20 million is not an angel investment, right? So we would have never been involved in that deal if things had played out this way. Well, things don't always play out the way you expect. By the spring of 2011, said hedge fund manager winds up in jail. He was actually running a Ponzi scheme, right? So when you find out your investor is running a Ponzi scheme and there's really no money to be had and they're supposed to be sending you money to pay payroll, puts you in a bind as a company. So Proterra was in a real bind and they did not have much cash in the bank because these guys hadn't sent all the money. So there were some very harrowing days and near-death experience for a few days with Proterra. But being the community that we are in Greenville, we weren't going to let that happen without a fight. So some of you know Catherine Smoke. She had been working on PR for the company. She got her husband Rick Davis involved at Elliott Davis, and they got other folks in the community involved, Mayor White, other business leaders, Tim Reed included, started to come together and say, what can we do to try to help this company? We don't have $20 million, but is there anything we can do to help them? Through Tim's involvement, UCAN got involved, and so we went to our investors and some of those business leaders in the community and said, is there any way we can put together some bridge financing to help these guys? Because we thought there were other people that might be interested in the bigger funding. So we did that. UCAN, along with SCRA, in a relatively short period of time, were able to put together a bridge note for the company, several $100,000, that would allow the company to buy time to finish a due diligence process with some venture capitalists that could fund the company in a big way. So we helped save the company at that point, and we were taking a risk. We didn't know if the VCs would come behind us, and if they didn't, it would have been game over. But fortunately, we took that bet, and it paid off. And in June of 2011, Proterra announced that one of the oldest, most venerated venture capital firms in the world was going to lead a $30 million investment in the company. So that's Kleiner Perkins out of Silicon Valley. They came in with GM Ventures and some other investors and put $30 million into the company, and it's taken off from there. They've raised quite a bit more venture capital in 4 rounds since then, and I think Proterra is going to be a great success story for our community. And again, not something an angel group typically would have done, but because we had that network here, we had that infrastructure here, and we had the business leadership here, we were able to help save a company that's really going to have a big impact, not on just Greenville, but really the world when you think about how they're going to change mass transit. So a great rise from the ashes story from our portfolio. Let me tell you another story about another big win, and this one's not so much an investment win as it is an investment or a win for our ecosystem in our state. So we focus on investments, but as JB mentioned, one of the things we did early on to our great benefit was get involved with the Angel Capital Association. So lots of folks had gone before us around the country and putting angel groups together. We knew we could learn a lot from what other folks had done. So we got pretty involved in the ACA, learned a lot from best practices. One of the things that we learned pretty quickly is that a lot of states have embraced this whole idea of angel investing in a big way, and they've created incentives for people in their state to do this. They've done that in a lot of different ways, but one primary way is through tax credits. And so we thought, well, maybe that's something we should explore in South Carolina. So we started having some conversations with the chamber and with this gentleman. Some of you knew Representative Bill Wiley, who we met early on in this process and had a great passion for what we were doing. He was a great business and community leader, had run large organizations, Stone Apparel and Umbro and Goodwill Industries. So he really got it and was passionate about it. So he started helping us in late 2009. Unfortunately, he passed away unexpectedly in 2010. But because of the relationship he had helped us build and the chamber had helped us build with the public policy folks, and particularly Mark Cothran, if you guys know Mark, and he's at Clemson now, but really helped us put together a plan for how we could go try to make the case to the state that it makes sense to create an angel investor tax credit here. After Representative Wiley passed away, Dwight Loftus here in Greenville, another representative, got behind what we were trying to do, and he got it, and he wanted to get involved, and so he helped us from there lead the charge to go down to Columbia and make the case for a state angel investor tax credit. And here's part of the logic for why we wanted to do that. Certainly it can benefit investors, but there's a bigger story here and why it makes sense. If you look at the data from the Census Bureau, it turns out that all net job growth in our economy comes from startups 5 years old and younger. And most of that comes from a very small segment of startups that grow really fast. So if we want job creation for the long term, it turns out that we really need to cultivate the entrepreneurial part of our economy. We can't predict what those industries will be, we can't predict what those jobs will be, but we can be pretty sure over time that even while some big companies create jobs, over time those big companies get competed away and industries like textiles, for instance, can fall out of favor or go offshore. And so you really need to be cultivating that next generation of jobs and companies. And we've got the data to prove it. So we're making this case in Columbia that, hey, this is good for our economy, and ultimately, if you want job growth, even though it's not as splashy as a Boeing and not as immediately impactful as a Boeing, which is a good thing, I'm certainly not knocking that, but it's harder to see the impact of this in the short term. You really have to think about the long game with startups. But we've got the data to show that over the long term, it pays off. In addition to that, if we want startups that can grow fast, one of the things they need is capital. Well, in South Carolina, we don't have much venture capital. You can see we're on the bottom of this list relative to our neighbors, which probably isn't too surprising, but when you've only got a handful of companies each year in South Carolina that can attract venture capital, that's not going to advance the game very quickly in terms of trying to generate funding for those potential fast growth startups, and particularly when you see how other states around us are doing. So we made the case to the state that, look, this is important for our long-term economic strategy and our growth. And so it only took about 4.5 years. And we learned a lot of things about the legislative process, and I learned that the political process in many ways doesn't bear a whole lot of resemblance sometimes to the business process or business logic. But finally, in 2013, the High Growth Small Business Job Creation Act of 2013 did pass the legislature, and Governor Haley signed it in June of 2013. And what that does at a high level is it creates a 35% income tax credit for investors who invest in qualified startups. So these startups have to apply to be qualified. There's some parameters around what that means. They're basically designed to be for early stage, high growth businesses. If the company's qualified and an accredited investor, that's an SEC rule we have to follow. So typically these investors need to be either $1 million in net worth or a couple $100,000 in income to be able to take the risk under SEC rules to invest in these startups. But if they make a qualified investment, they can get a 35% tax credit for that investment, which is a really important tool in our tool bag. And so we had great support for this around the state. Again, the Upstate Chamber Coalition was really the leading champion for this alongside us. We had lots of partners around the state that helped us make that happen. And we think it's really going to be an impactful thing for the state. And we're starting to get the data to prove it. One of the things we did in the legislation is say, look, we need to be able to measure this, so there's certain data we want to capture so we can see whether this works or not. So we did that, and my clicker doesn't seem to be working at this point. So perhaps, would you mind thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I got lots of animations in here, so there's lots of button pushing to do, so I apologize for that. We've got some data that suggests the credit's working. So again, 2013, the bill passed in June, so we didn't have a full year, and certainly we had to get the word out. So you'd expect there to be a significant jump from one year to the next, but we do see that jump, so that's encouraging. Over 100% growth in the number of qualified businesses from one year to the next. It appears this is working now, thank you. Similarly, over 100% growth in the counties that had a qualified business across the state, so from 6 to 13. And you can see, not surprisingly, Greenville leads the charge in terms of qualified businesses. Charleston not far behind, Spartanburg coming on as well. So we're starting to see this take hold across the state. And on the investor side, Tremendous growth in applications from 13 to 14. Again, awareness is increasing, so more and more people are aware and taking advantage of it, but not everybody gets approved. You have to meet certain qualifications, so they are doing their job in terms of evaluating those applications when they come in. The amount of credits that were actually approved has grown significantly. So the legislation caps the available credits at $5 million. So no more than $5 million can be allocated in any given year. The first year we wound up at about $1.4 million in a partial year, so that was a good start. Last year we got to $3 million in credits, although it turns out if you have to apply for the credit by the end of the year in which you invest. And so if you miss the deadline in 2014, it just so happens that there's a one-time extension available that ends today. So if you invested last year and you didn't apply, you got until 5 o'clock to try to get an application into the Department of Revenue to claim that credit. So hopefully we'll see this number go up a bit from last year. But we see the trajectory we want. Hopefully we'll get the full $5 million allocated this year. And so that implies that last year, in order to get these credits, that was $4 million that went into startups that qualified for this credit. Last year was $8 million, and so we want to continue to see that grow. At a full allocation of $5 million, that'd get us to about $14 million pulled into startups to fund those to get this credit.
Is that calendar or is that?
Calendar.
Okay. It's not the same.
Calendar year. That's right. It operates on a calendar year. So, good question. Well, there we go. And the counties from which investors come has grown. And one other point I want to make here is that we designed it to be a transferable credit so that we can get people with money elsewhere to bring it here. We'll spend their money here for them if they'd like to do that. So if they're out of state and they want to invest here, they can sell the credit. And so that's another way for us to help fund startups here. So we're excited about this win for the state. We think it's important for trying to get more capital into this space. We did the math. At the time, we thought there were about 120,000 accredited investors in South Carolina. If you assume the minimum net worth of $1 million and you assume an allocation to this asset class of 5%, which is sort of where most people start thinking about doing angel investing, if we could get 1% of that population of 120,000 people to start doing this, that'd be $57 million worth of capital we could put to work for startups. That's a pretty good sized first round venture fund. So again, we think there's a big potential impact from this. So we hope that you will help us spread the word about this and get more folks to take advantage of it. So that was a big win for the state. Let me wrap up with the last story here about a flywheel effect. So this is a flywheel. It's a device for storing mechanical energy. You push on it. They're used in lots of different applications, but you push on it over time, you can sort of build up its momentum where it can maintain some of that momentum for you, and you don't have to keep pushing on it quite so hard. And this concept comes from a book that many of you, I see some nodding heads, are familiar with, Jim Collins. I'm a big fan of his work and this book. And what he says about a flywheel in many ways is that good to great comes from a cumulative process where little by little, step by step, decision by decision, you're turning this flywheel. It takes a lot of energy and effort to get that flywheel turning in the early going, but over time it becomes easier and easier as you build up momentum. And so if you can continue to push on it and continue to sustain that effort, eventually the momentum kicks in your favor and it becomes easier to sustain that motion, and you can get to some pretty spectacular results. So this flywheel effect is one that we think about a lot when we're thinking about building from UCAN to this state tax credit to what we're trying to do now, which is take this model of angel investing and build it out across the state and build an infrastructure for that across the state to turn a flywheel so that we can take all these inputs we've been working on for the last 7 years, take that momentum and sustain it so that ultimately we've got a robust, sustainable infrastructure here for early stage capital for our entrepreneurs and for our economy. So in order to do that, we've got we've started something called the South Carolina Angel Network. And what that is really just what I've said. It's a network of angel investor groups like UCAN around the state that is working to improve our entrepreneurial infrastructure, along with lots of folks that are doing great work on the startup side. We're doing it on the capital side by making a more efficient market for access to early stage capital inside our state, where historically it's been difficult to do that. So we certainly have our hands full trying to keep things going at UCAN, but we partnered up with two guys who were familiar with our work from a sponsorship that they had with UCAN, who are really passionate about it. Paul Clark on the left and Charlie Banks on the right. Paul's here in Greenville, Charlie's in Columbia. And they were passionate about this and saw the opportunity to help us take this across the state. So we formed a group to go do this called SCAN. And now we have a pretty significant network across the state. So we started with the UCAN model here in 2008. And then in the fall of 2013, The Tiger Angel Network, which is a group of Clemson alumni, formed, and they are part of our network. In the spring of 2014, we launched the Capital Angels in Columbia. Later that summer, the folks up the mountains in Asheville came to us and said, hey, we'd like to do this, can you help us? And we said, well, we probably can. We know a little bit about this, so we'd be glad to help you. So now we co-manage a group in Asheville, North Carolina, called the Asheville Angels. Earlier this year, we launched the Spartanburg Angels. We launched the Low Country Angels in Charleston. We just launched the Anderson Angels down the road, the Electric City Angels in Anderson about 3 or 4 months ago. We are launching the Central Savannah River Angels in the Aiken area this fall. And then we have conversations going in a few other places around the state. Again, with the idea to build an infrastructure, we can share the back office and the deal flow and all the administrative side of this to try to build out our infrastructure for early stage investing. We also started a fund last year, a sidecar fund, so maybe people that don't have time to participate in the angel activity can put capital to work passively alongside the angels when they invest, co-invest with our angels. And then we also have the early beginnings of really an educational nonprofit to really help take the educational piece of this to market in terms of teaching entrepreneurs and investors how to think about putting capital to work in this asset class. So again, we're trying to turn this flywheel to make a more robust and sustainable infrastructure for early stage capital in South Carolina. And we've got a lot of good momentum. We've got over 200 investors in the group at this point. These groups are already starting to invest. I think across those new groups, they've made 7 investments at this point. So we're excited about the momentum that we're building. And what we're trying to do is create value in South Carolina for startups, give them an easier, more efficient way to access capital than they have in the past, a place to aggregate investors. It's hard to go do it one-off as an entrepreneur to meet with enough investors to fund your company, and then also get access to that intellectual capital, not just the financial capital, but the intellectual capital of those investors. For investors, we like to talk about this is an opportunity to make money, have fun, and do good. So we're obviously trying to be disciplined about how we invest. If we don't make money, we will go away. So we have to be disciplined about that, and we have a process for that. It's fun to be in the room with other investors and entrepreneurs working on cool ideas and new companies. And it's good. We've talked about the economic impact that this can have, and so we really believe in that part of what we do as well. And then for the state, obviously we're trying to improve infrastructure here for early stage capital so we can attract and retain our best and brightest and our entrepreneurs that need access to capital so they don't have to go elsewhere to find it. And we think that's a great foundation for long-term economic growth in our state. So to wrap it up and just try to extract a couple of morals from some of these stories, one of the things that we're trying to do is help cultivate entrepreneurial mindsets. Whether you're told no initially, we don't want to hire you for the job, and you persist, and that opportunity comes back around, or you're near death as a startup. Most startups are going to have multiple near-death experiences. Finding a way to navigate through that and find a way to stay alive, those are the kind of mindsets that we want to create with our startups and with our investors. Be willing to take risks, swing for the fences, be comfortable with failure. You're going to strike out some, but that doesn't mean the game is over. We'll come back and get another at-bat. We really are blessed to live in this business community. I think the Proterra story is just one small example of that, and just the business leadership we have here and the willingness to go to work and get things done is a fun. It's a fun business community to be in, and we certainly have the chamber to thank for a lot of that. We're a small state. We find ourselves on the wrong end of most of the state rankings on most things we care about, but working together, we can be a powerful state, and we're small enough where we can do it in practical terms, and so we're seeing evidence of that with our groups, and we want to keep that up. And we've proven with our model we can do what we want to do, which is make money, have fun, and do good, and we want to do more and more of that all the time. And we think this model is a sustainable way to do it. And then finally, we want folks like you to help us turn the flywheel in terms of inviting investors to get involved with what we do, make them aware of this as a way to come get exposed to and educated about this asset class if they haven't done it before. For entrepreneurs to learn about what it takes to get funding from angel investors, we do a lot of educational programs to help with that. So we want to engage the community to help us spread the word and see more and more of this kind of activity in our economy. So that's what I wanted to share with you this morning. I hope the stories were better than just a bunch of numbers, which is what I'm inclined to do. But really appreciate your time, and thank you for being here this morning. Thank you. Out of time for Q&A.